So anyway, I want to ask a question tonight. Something is wrong with America, and I think anyone who looks around knows there is something wrong in this country. But there was a price paid for the independence of the United States of America. There were 56 men who originally signed the Declaration of Independence, and they knew ahead of time that when they signed that Declaration of Independence, they were risking everything they owned. Every one of them were, I guess you would put in the category of rich men, in that they own different things such as farms, plantations. Many of them owned everything themselves. They ran their own businesses. They were lawyers, merchants. Some of them were farmers, large plantation owners, but they were all educated men, and they were of independent means. They were dependent upon no one. And when they signed the Declaration of Independence in July 4th, 1776, every one of them knew that they were risking their entire livelihood plus their families to stand up against the British government. But since these men did sign, and they declared that the United States would be a free and independent country, what happened to these men? Paul Harvey put out a very interesting book, and many of you, well, we come on right before he does, or right after he does here in Woodward. But he's got a book called The Rest of the Story, in which he tells about these 56 men. And we've put that out in the August 1983 lead article, Dismantling America for World Government. So you can read about it and see what happened. But every one of these men lost everything to make sure that you and I could live as free people. The United States was founded originally, and it's my personal belief, after looking at all the documents that I've been able to look through, our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta, and all the original documents of the United States, and I believe personally that God inspired this country to come into being. That's my personal belief. It's the only nation in the history of the world outside of Israel which was God's chosen people at that time to be an example to the rest of the world if they would obey. And on the other hand, if they disobeyed, He declared what would happen to them. And it has happened exactly like He said, which is further proof that God does exist. But the United States is the only country that's ever declared itself a Christian nation. In 1892, the Supreme Court of the United States stated that we were a Christian nation. But something has happened since that time. Now, lately, I would say in the last 60 years, probably those of you who are older in this group know that things have changed rapidly, little by little. And then in the last 2 decades, I would say, or 20 to 30 years, things have deteriorated much more rapidly. In Revelation chapter 19, I want to start out by quoting what is going to happen at the end of the age, the very end of the age, and then give you an update as to what's going to happen to merge us into a one-world government that's prophesied in the book of Revelation. But in Revelation chapter 19, starting in verse 11, it shows that Jesus Christ, with the angels and with the saints who have already been resurrected and met Jesus Christ at the Sea of Glass, according to Revelation 15, verse 2, they're going to descend to this earth. And down in verse 19, it shows they're going to take a personality called the Beast, and he's going to defeat the armies of the earth. Then with this beast personality, which most people in religious circles call the Antichrist, along with this beast there is also a false prophet. Or in Revelation chapter 13, it calls him another beast because of the activities he'll be engaged in. Both of these personalities, this great false prophet who worked miracles in order to deceive the world and cause them to worship this beast as the false Messiah. Only he's not going to be called the false Messiah, he's going to be called the real Messiah. They're going to be thrown alive into a lake of fire. And then the remnant of the armies of this great empire is going to be destroyed, according to Revelation chapter 19, verse 21. And then on into chapter 20. The real driving force behind the rise of the social system is Satan the devil. He's going to be taken. He's going to be bound. And he's going to have a seal set over him for 1,000 years. And in verse 4 through 6, it states very clearly that Jesus Christ is going to establish a 1,000-year rule over this earth. And that you and I, if we are New Testament Christians, then you and I will have opportunity to live and reign with Jesus Christ for 1,000 years and to bring salvation to other people who have been deceived by Satan and who live on into this period of time and start having children and repopulating the earth after all the devastating wars that are going to occur. But now let's back up in Revelation chapter 13, to Revelation 13, and in verse 1, we see that a beast is rising out of the sea. And when you compare that with Revelation 17, verse 15, you see that the sea is humanity. All the human beings on the earth is considered the sea in symbolism in the book of Revelation. So this is an end-time world government that's going to rise out of the sea of humanity. This could not have been understood until the middle of the 1800s. Around 1850 is when international socialism, which is called Marxism, began to be expounded in Germany, Poland, and Austria. And ever since that time, there have been problems going on in the world. And they have actually tried to expand and are trying to work in every nation on earth at one time. So truly, this government that's going to come up will be a world government, and it'll rise out of the sea of humanity all at once. But then this is going to be a world government. Then in verse 4, we see that they worship the dragon. Now this is Satan, which gave power unto the beast. And they worship the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And I think before this evening's over, you're going to see there is coming a world armed forces. It is coming. And so no nation on earth is going to be able to stand up against this one world armed forces. And as a direct result, you and I in this country will say, well, who can make war against them? We don't have the military equipment. Because we're going to see tonight and tomorrow night that our armed forces are going to be turned over to an international peacekeeping force. And it's going to be a world government. So this is going to be an international war-making machinery. Then verse 7 it says, And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And there's a reason for this, because there is going to be promoted, and it is right now on the world scene, someone called Maitreya, or the Christ. Only he's not going to be Jesus Christ. It's a man who has a Christ-like spirit. And it's all it is just evolution. And those people in the occult who are Luciferian worshipers are promoting this end-time world government. We'll see that. And power was given unto him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. So this means it is going to be a world government. So we've seen a world government, a world military apparatus, and then down in verse 15 and 16 and 17, they're going to create an image to the beast. And it's going to be used to control the world. And you and I, or not you and I necessarily, but all inhabitants of the earth are going to be required to worship the beast as the Messiah. Not only that, but this image that's erected to him. And if you don't worship them, the possibility's there that you could be killed. You could be killed. So martyrdom of the saints is going to occur. So there is coming a one-world religion in which every person is going to have to be a part of it. And if not, then you, since you're not accepting the Christ, then you're going to be an apostate. You're going to be anti-Christ according to them, because anyone in opposition to Christ is an anti-Christ. And since they're going to promote this world dictator as the Messiah, then if you worship him, so you're worshiping the correct person. And if not, then you're in opposition to the Messiah. So they're going to put you to death. That's a possibility. Then in verse 16 and 17, And he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in the forehead, and that no man might buy or sell except he that had the mark. And it talks about a number, 666, and it has to do with the name of this beast system or this person who's coming on the world scene. Now from all this, we've seen there's going to be a world military force, there's going to be a world government, a world church, and there's also going to be an international or world trading combine, in which unless you are a part of the system, you can't buy or sell. You can't buy gasoline, food, clothing, you can't pay the electricity on your home, you can't pay for heating, you can't even pay taxes on your home. So no matter what, if you're not a part of the system in worshiping the Messiah, then you will not be a part of that final world system if you don't become engaged in it. So now what I want to do is go back and give you a background as to just two of the organizations that's now rising to promote world government. I'll give more tomorrow night. But right now there's 10,000 organizations in the United States alone which is a part of this international network, Dismantling America, to promote a world government. 10,000 in this country alone. And it has been published, because those who are behind this end-time conspiracy said 1979 they would come out of the closet, out of secrecy, and it's wide open. And none of this information was really available before that time. And that's why it's such a surprise now that it's being preached all across the country. But nothing upsets liberals and left-wingers in the Congress of the United States more than equating socialism with international communism. And yet ever since 1905, when the Intercollegiate Communist Society was established, the socialists and the liberals in the Congress of the United States have tried to give a term or a tone of respectability to the word socialism. But in 1921 it had grown so bad, and this particular organization had become under such suspicion, that they changed the name to the League for Industrial Democracy. And they adopted a motto, and when you hear the motto, you'll know immediately it's pure socialism. It's production for use, not for profit. Now you know why Chrysler Corporation went down the tubes. Finally they asked for a cut in wages, and the minute they started making profits again, now the leaders of the unions are now going to go on strike again unless they can renegotiate their contract to see to it there's no profits anymore in business in this country. But socialism, as I said, had become a scare word by the year 1905. But from the years of 1905 through 1955, the League for Industrial Society, or Democracy, claimed as some of its members, advisors, cooperators, and also as recipients of awards from this organization, such nationally known men as, and I'll name some of them, and you who are older in the audience may recognize most of these names. The younger ones, maybe only a few. Ralph Bunche, George S. Counts, Clarence Darrah, Eugene V. Debs, John Dewey, Senator Paul Douglas, David Dubinsky, Senator Hubert H. Humphrey, probably everybody's heard of him, Max Lerner, Walter Lippmann, George Meany, Senator Wayne Morris, A.J. Muskie, Niebuhr Reinhold, Harry A. Overstreet, Walter Reuther, probably everybody's heard of him, and I know everybody's heard of this person, Eleanor Roosevelt. To be exact, the Roosevelts were the first ones to come into such power in the United States. They thought that the whole United States would become a socialist country before Roosevelt was out of office. To be exact, he became so powerful in his socialistic programs that we had to pass laws in this country. And incidentally, I want to say that's while I was a child, so I remember, though, I read the textbooks. But anyway, we had to pass laws restricting the term of the presidency to just 2 4-year periods because of this man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But you'll note that all of these men that I mentioned had something in common. They were all key people in the fields of government, education, religion, law, labor, communications, and international diplomacy within the years of 1905 to 1955, every one of them. Now I want to read a Socialist Prediction. Norman Thomas, who ran 6 times for the presidency of the United States on the Socialist Party, stated this, and I quote, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism. So every time you read or hear of a liberal congressman, you know what that man's doing." Now listen to the rest of this. "They will adopt," that's you and me, "our representatives in the Congress of the United States under the name of liberalism will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until America will one day be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened." And that's exactly what's going on today. You ask the average person on the street, they know everything's wrong, but they don't know how it got that way. And they don't have a solution for it either. But then let's look at a communist prediction and see if there is a reason to equate socialism with communism. 3 months before Nikita Khrushchev came here for a visit in 1959, he made this statement, and I quote, "We can't expect the American people to jump from capitalism," that's our present form of government, "to communism. But we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they awaken one day to find that they have communism." Now this is exactly what was planned for the United States of America by those who are socialist communists. Now 63 years ago, there was a discovery, and it was brought before the Joint Legislative Committee investigating seditious activities in the United States. And this was filed with the Senate of New York, the state of New York. This was April 24th, 1920. This was 63 years ago. Now listen to what this says, and then I want to give you what was filed by the assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, and this is an update, and see if these goals have changed. Volume 1 of the Lusk Report states, and I quote, this is the general introduction, Those representing the socialist point of view are the Socialist Party of America, the Communist Party of America, and the Socialist Labor Party and the Communist Labor Party of America. A study of their platforms and official pronouncements shows that they do not differ fundamentally in their objectives. These objectives are, number one, the establishment of a cooperative commonwealth in the place of the present form of government in the United States, just like the Soviet Union has. Everything is in common. Well, everything is in common for the leaders. And all the other people have is poverty. That's what they have in common. And a second point, the overthrow of what they are pleased to call the capitalist system, namely the present system under which we live, and the substitution in its place of the collective ownership and the management of the means of production and distribution by the working class. So they want to take over all business, so there's no free enterprise whatsoever. And that's exactly what's happening in the United States of America. I just want to make one little sidelight right quick, and then I'll get back to the subject. But a lot of people have wondered why stocks have been suppressed. Now, when I say suppressed, I don't mean that the Dow Jones market goes up, the value of stocks. I mean when you have stock and you never get a dividend, or maybe you get 3 cents a share as a dividend. Well, that's because a lot of the people who are behind this whole end-time program are international bankers, such as your Chase Manhattan and many others on the world scene, all over the world, mainly in New York City, London, Paris, and Hamburg, Germany. But what they do, they'll come in privately, and the law does not require them to reveal who is the owner. So they become secret owners of over half of your large corporations, over 50% of the shares. And then they give loans, big, huge loans to these corporations. So the corporations have to pay their profits in interest to the banks. So the banks siphon off all profits from your large corporations. So that you and I put up the money to run the corporations, we take the risk, and then we share in no profits. All the profits go directly to the bankers who are financing the overthrow of our government. But now there is what's called socialism by legislation. This is a socialist. There is a main difference between a socialist and a communist, is that a socialist wants to go in and pass laws to socialize a country. But a communist wants to go in and overthrow by armed forces and impose the same socialistic government upon the people. The prime objective of socialists and communists is to centralize all power in Washington, D.C. All power. If the socialist communists can simply destroy all states' rights, they're only dealing with one government, Washington, D.C., instead of 50 separate state governments and then the federal government with it. So let's examine the 10th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Let's see what it says. It states, and I quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution." So this is the federal government. Anything not delegated directly to the federal government are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Think about that for a minute. And then you can begin to pinpoint what's wrong with America. Nowhere in the Constitution does it ever give the federal government any power or control over education, and yet every state in the Union is controlled by the federal government by direct aid to schools. And therefore we have to take federal textbooks and teach what the federal government tells us to. There's nowhere in the Constitution that gives the federal government any priority over health, welfare, labor, dams and public projects, agricultural, unemployment, or housing. That's just a few of them. And yet the federal government is in every one of those programs. So according to the Constitution, the regulation of all of those programs should remain within the jurisdiction of the state or to you and I as the individual citizens. But now remember the predictions of both the socialists and the communists. They said that they would pass legislation, and one day America would wake up as a socialist country and not even know how it happened. And that's exactly what's happened. So now you can know, no matter which party controls the House or the Senate or whoever is elected the President of the United States, it just doesn't matter. We head continually toward the road of socialism. Ronald Reagan happened to be the most conservative president to come along in over 60 years. He was elected by a 76% consensus of the voting public. And yet none of his platforms and programs have been passed. A few of them and then all of a sudden they slice it back, like your 30% tax cut that was supposed to come along. Well, they just instituted other taxes, and you ended up with maybe a penny or two here and there as a cut, but no more. To be exact, they even went on and wanted to increase taxes, and we'll get to that. To be exact, just read the August issue of Newswatch magazine, and you'll know why they have to constantly increase taxes. Because today, there are only 71 million taxpayers in the United States, and there's 81 million citizens of this country on some form of federal assistance. Now, you stop and think about it. What if you own a business, and you have to pay double and triple the taxes in order to support 10 other people out there besides yourself who are on welfare? How long are you going to stay in business? You're going to fold your doors and you're going to go away somewhere. And so since you're not going to pay taxes anymore, somebody else has to be taxed. So the other guy who is still working and trying to buck the system and earn a living is going to have to pay more taxes. That's why they constantly increase taxes to pay for those ever increasing who are on welfare. So the federal government uses control over every area in varying degrees based upon how much they support that particular project. And the reason they can do this, the socialist communists in the United States entered a lawsuit in 1942 and took it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. It was called Wickard versus Filburn. Now, they did this deliberately in order to get a certain judgment that they wanted. And attached to that, and they filed in a certain court in Washington, D.C. because one of their people happened to sit on as the judge in that particular district. He attached one sentence to that judgment. And ever since then, this is what the federal government has used in order to take over states' rights and take it out of you and my hands. And here's what that statement says. It is hardly a lack of due process for the government to regulate that which it subsidizes. So every time the federal government comes in and subsidizes any project, they regulate it, and it's out of the state's hands. Then it's out of the city's hands. So pretty soon you eliminate all forms of government except the federal. And the people sitting out here on the state legislatures and the local municipalities become nothing more than administrators for the federal government. To be exact, every police force but one in the United States today is subsidized by the government. That means if martial law is called for in the United States, you have all police forces become federalized because they are subsidized. Therefore, the federal government will regulate them. Each new federal law that's passed by the Congress that invades a state's rights actually strengthens the control of the federal government, and which is already controlled by the socialists in this country. J. Edgar Hoover happened to have been the longest head of the FBI of any other man. He made a speech in 1957 to the National Convention of the American Legion. He stated, and I quote, "To dismiss lightly the existence of the subversive threat in the United States is to deliberately commit national suicide. In some quarters, we're doing exactly that." The July 30th, 1953 report, Jenner Committee, is probably the most comprehensive report that has ever been filed with the Congress of the United States on subversive activities. I want to give the 7 points that they came up with. Number one, the Soviet International Organization, remember this is communist and socialist, has carried on a successful and important penetration of the United States government, and this penetration has not been fully exposed. Now remember, this was 30 years ago. Point number two, this penetration has extended from the lower ranks to the top level policy and operating positions in our government. Number three, the agents of this penetration have operated in accord with a distinct design fashioned by their superiors. That's amazing. This was filed 30 years ago. It was taken directly out of the congressional record. Anybody can go and look it up and read it with their own eyes. And yet, for some reason, we think that there is no threat from socialism and communism in this country anymore. That's because they control the media, and I want to go into that tomorrow night. Number four, members of this conspiracy help to get each other into government. They help each other to rise in government, and they protected each other from exposure while in government. Number five, in general, the communists who infiltrated our government worked behind the scenes. Notice what they did. They never stepped out in the forefront and took the blame for anything that was done. Here's what they did. They worked behind the scenes, guiding research and preparing memoranda on which basic American policies were set. So from behind the scene, unelected officials are sitting up there, appointees. They're called bureaucrats, and they go on wages. And then when they've worked so long, they have seniority, they can't be fired. So they're there year after year after year, and nobody can seem to get rid of them. But they're the enemies. That's why they set up the government the way they did. They also write speeches for cabinet officers, influence congressional investigations. They draft laws. Now, what was one of the things they wanted to do? Go in and infiltrate into the government and pass laws to convert us to socialism. Manipulate administrative reorganizations, always serving the interest of their superiors. Number 6, policies and programs laid down by the members of this conspiracy are still in effect within our government and constitute a continuing hazard to our national security. That was way back in 1953 when that was mentioned. Now I want to give a summary of 45 points, and I won't hit all of them, but I'm going to give the ones that I think are most important. That was discovered by W.C. Cleon Skousen for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, he was the assistant to J. Edgar Hoover. He discovered the following, and this comes directly from the Congressional Record of the United States. Anyone can go look at it. They can copy it, make photocopies. It's in the records. Number 1, they wanted to convince the United States to accept coexistence as the only alternative to atomic war. And that's what we hear all the time. Sit down at the summit. Talk again. Talk. It's called détente. They'd rather have talk than a hot war. But meanwhile, the Soviet apparatus all over the world is causing Nicaragua to fall, San Salvador to fall, while we talk. That's the job. That's what they want to do. Number 2, they want to convince the United States to capitulate or to give in rather than engaging in atomic war. So just give up rather than kill everybody on Earth, destroying all population. Number 3, develop the illusion that total disarmament by the United States would be a demonstration of moral strength. And after all, since we're a Christian nation, this proves our character. That's what they use against us. Number 4, permit free trade between all nations. That's why our trade barriers have been dropped. That's why the tariffs are now gone and have disappeared. And there's such a flood of foreign goods all across our country. Notice the reason why they've done that, though. Not just so that we could buy a Toyota and get better mileage and let it drive forever on 1 gallon of gas, as I heard a commercial yesterday say. Here's the reason why. Permit free trade between all nations, regardless of whether the items could be used for war. Because the Soviet Union wants our war materials. And so they want free trade. They also wanted an extension of long-term loans to Russia and all of her satellites. This way, they'd not have to repay them, and we would support them because, as Khrushchev said in 1959, one day they'll bury us. Also, as a part of the platform, with these long-term loans, they wanted to institute what they call United States foreign aid to all nations. This act was passed in 1946. Every nation on the face of the earth receives foreign aid from the United States, including every Soviet country. And the amazing thing is that if you would take the last 10 years of foreign aid, it would pay the entire national debt of the United States of America. Now do you understand why they want us to spread our money all over the world? To bankrupt us as a nation. And if they can cause collapse, we're going to willingly accept their government or their solution. Number 7, they wanted to grant recognition of Red China. Now this was discovered before World War II. This is amazing. Because they knew they were going to cause China to collapse and become communist, and once it did, they wanted to set up a one-world government through the United Nations, and they wanted every communist country to be admitted to it. So they wanted it admitted to the United Nations, and have you and I seen this in the last 5 years? 6 years? 7 years? Yes, we have. The Nixon administration started it. The Carter administration solved the whole problem, and now they're sitting in the United Nations, and they kicked little Taiwan, our ally, out. They also said they wanted to set up East and West Germany as separate states. That's a reality. It's happened, past history. Somebody has influence. They wanted to prolong the conferences to ban atomic tests because our government agreed to suspend all of our nuclear tests as long as negotiations were in progress. They could keep negotiating, get ahead of us while we were suspending all of our negotiations. They also wanted, this is a 10th point, they wanted all Soviet satellites to have representation in the United Nations. And we're going to get to the United Nations in just a minute. Remember this next point above everything that I'll say to introduce the next topic. They wanted to promote the United Nations as the only hope for mankind. The only hope. Have you ever heard that before? I have heard that from even radio evangelists. The United Nations, man is searching for a way to keep from destroying himself through the nuclear holocaust that they predict is going to come. And they said, if the Charter of the United Nations is rewritten, demand that it be set up as a one-world government, now get this, with its own independent armed forces. What did the book of Revelation say? Verse 4 of chapter 13, no man could make war against the beast. And then I'm going to skip down some of these, but they wanted to dismantle the United States by using technical decisions in the courts so they could allow murderers, rapists, and so on to be turned loose on society to continue to terrorize it. Therefore, you and I as a citizen would think our Constitution doesn't work. Therefore, we would become such a lawless society and so oppressed by the murderers, the rapists, that we would ask for another type of government, a strong armed government. So I'll skip on down a few of these, especially the infiltration in the colleges and universities, and we'll print that Newswatch magazine at a later date. But I want to get to the infiltration of the press. And I have within my possession, which I'll have here tomorrow night, and I'll open it up and show everybody here, those people who are a part of the press of the United States today who are a part of this conspiracy. I'll name them, every one of them, if we have time. They wanted to gain key positions in radio, television, motion pictures. They wanted to continue through all of these means to discredit our culture. They wanted to discredit it by using such things as nude movies to make us become immoral. They wanted to promote perverted books, perversion of every style and kind that you can imagine. That's why there's approximately 50 to 75 nude magazines that you can go down to bookstores, pick up every variety of nudity you want. They wanted to control all art critics, and I'll give you a direct quote by one of their top men. He said, and I quote, "Our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive and meaningless art." That was their goal for destroying culture in this America. They wanted to eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship. Have you heard that word, censorship? Now you know where it comes from. Socialists, communists working behind the scenes to destroy our culture, which is Christianity, so declared by the 1892 Supreme Court of the United States. They wanted to present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, healthy, and natural. They call it alternative lifestyles instead of sin. And that's what you and I are exposed to continuously. They wanted to infiltrate the churches. They've done it. 1/3 of the Baptist preachers across this country are humanist. The Baptists admit it. Episcopalians, United Methodists, they're totally infiltrated. They're a humanist organization now. There is nothing spiritual coming out of those organizations anymore. And there's others, but I won't name them. They wanted to replace revealed religion from the Bible with social religion. They wanted to discredit the Bible and say it is nothing but a spiritual crutch. They wanted us to grow up and mature and not use this religious crutch to lean on. Two of their organizations that are the most effective right now are the World and National Council of Churches. To be exact, the World Council of Churches president was a Soviet, a member of the Communist Party. And he went to Nigeria several years back in the 70s, and he emerged from the World Council of Churches as president of that organization. And he was recently interviewed on 60 Minutes on CBS television. And of course he denied that it is nothing more than an organization that accepts money from such church groups as the Salvation Army, United Methodists, and so on, and uses that money to promote international socialism and the overthrow of governments in Africa and South America. But of course, if you have the facts, you know that they do. They wanted to eliminate prayer and any phase of religious expression in the schools. Does that sound familiar? Sure it does. You and I can't pray, or our children can't pray in schools. They wanted to discredit the American Constitution, calling it inadequate and out of step. You ought to find a good bookstore and buy a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski called, if I can see the name of it, Between Two Ages. This man admits he's a socialist. He was the number one right-hand man of Jimmy Carter. He ran the government of the United States. To be exact, he was handpicked by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski 3 years before they started promoting him for the presidency of the United States. They sat down and ate with him in London, England. And he was one of the founders of the Trilateral Commission, and yet he was a born-again Baptist. And they diverted the minds away from the people of the United States so that they could further their expansion. Within this book called, I see the name of it again, Between Two Ages, Brzezinski states very clearly that there is a schedule they're shooting for, and that is 1989, in which they want to establish a Marxist government in the United States and dismantle our Constitution. They said they are striving for that by the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. That's not far off. Of course, they shot for 1976 also, and they didn't make it, so they had to postpone it. But they wanted to go on. There's about 15 other of these, but I want to skip through some of them. But they wanted to infiltrate and gain control of big business. They wanted to create monopolies, with the bankers owning over 50% of these giant monopolies, giant corporations, such as May Corporation, which has all these department stores all over the country. In St. Louis, their famous bar. I don't know what they are out in this part of the country. But these giant multinational corporations, the banks, as I said before, would supply money. They would give them loans so that the loans, interest would have to come back on those loans. You and I, as a stockholder, would receive no dividends. And therefore, the international bankers would simply transfer money from you and my pocket to theirs, and just to heap treasures upon treasures, because money is where the name of the game is. Money is power. When they control all money, you and I are helpless. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're transferring all wealth into their own hands and away from us. But there's just a couple of more, and then I want to get into something that's quite interesting also. They wanted to internationalize the Panama Canal. Now, has the Panama Canal been taken away from the United States? Yes, it has. It now belongs to the country of Panama. Do you know why? Because Panama was in such debt to the international bankers. The international bankers knew they would never get their money back unless Panama controlled the canal. Panama got all the tariffs instead of the United States government of ships going through there. Then they could pay the international bankers back. So they gave away our canal so that they could collect their money. They wanted to overthrow all colonial governments once small countries all over the world were released and given nation status of their own, self-governing away from the British Empire, the French and the Germans. And that's exactly what's happened all over the world, all over Africa, South America. Everywhere there is a little country that tries to become self-governing, they're always overthrown by the socialist Marxists before they can establish their government. And now here's another point, and I think you need to listen to this very carefully. They want to repeal the Connolly Reservation so that the United States cannot prevent the World Court from seizing jurisdiction over internal, that's the United States, problems. They would give the World Court jurisdiction over every nation on earth and individuals alike. Now, what does this mean to you and me? If there is a world court, and I'm standing here exposing those, which I'm going to do tomorrow night, I'm going to name names of people who are involved in this whole thing in the United States. Senators, congressmen, businessmen, representatives. bankers, and many others. But if I stand up and speak their name, they can take me to court in The Hague, in Holland, the World Court. They will make the decision if I am guilty. Because you see, there is now before the Congress of the United States, and this has come up about every 4 or 5 years since 1948, it's called the Genocide Convention. If the Genocide Convention is passed, by my standing here tonight, I could be tried in the World Court if found guilty of even hurting someone by mentioning their nationality, or if I speak against their religion as being false, then I could be sent away, and you would never hear from me again. The World Court will get you out of your own country, be tried by other people than your own peers, which our Constitution guarantees. And this is coming up before the Congress of the United States very soon again, and hopefully it's going to be rejected. Now, the liberal and socialist communist conspiracy in the United States, there's been a little more talked about it by a Senator Carl Munt. He stated on August 17, 1961, that socialism and communism are exactly the same. He said that when you mention socialism and communism in the same breath, the socialists cringe. And the reason he stated that was that they're ideological blood brothers. One of them just passes legislation, the other one overthrows by military force. Senator Strom Thurmond is very familiar with what's going on in the United States. This man, who is a senator from, I believe it's South Carolina, has studied this for 40-something years. And he stated, and I quote, "Since Marxist socialists share the ultimate goal of the communists, their opposition to communism is limited. These Marxist socialists in our country support anti-communism, notice, only so long as it is aimed exclusively at the communist armed threat." So those people who are socialists in this country and who are working feverishly for the dismantling of this country and overthrow of it, they want world socialism, but they don't want the Russians to control it, nor do they want the Chinese. But they want to control it themselves. People like the Rothschilds of England, the Rockefellers of New York, and others which we'll name specifically tomorrow night. But Senator Thurmond went on to show that any time that if you destroy one liberty, that's all, just one, then you are in the process of eroding all liberty, and if you destroy economic freedom, then all other freedoms fall right behind it, because liberty is indivisible. And so what is it that they're really working on the fastest right now? It's the new international economic order. And on the yellow sheets that we have there, you'll see the universal code marks on one corner. This is the coming new money system that they're going to promote. But we've been talking about socialists and communists so far. I want to give a quote. This is taken from V.I. Lenin. That's the name of the book, Selected Works, Volume 7, page 298. Quote, "As long as capitalism and socialism exist, we cannot live in peace. Since 1917, there's been no peace on the earth. None. It's my personal belief that Revelation chapter 24, where it says wars and rumors of wars, that is a direct fulfillment of that prophecy. There has been no peace in the world since international socialism reared its ugly head with the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917. But I'll go on and read the rest of this. As long as capitalism and socialism exist, we cannot live in peace. In the end, one or the other will triumph. A funeral dirge will be sung over either the Soviet republics or over world capitalism." That's us, folks. One or the other. So we have lived, most of us, especially the older people who saw the overthrow of the Tsar. Then they came into World War II and saw Russia move into the Middle East. Incidentally, World War II could have been won very easily 2 years before it was. But the United States, Churchill, Roosevelt made a special agreement that they would wait until Russia could rearm and move into the Middle East because they guaranteed them a partition of Europe. And so, you see, some of our most powerful leaders were actually in on the conspiracy to destroy our country. So we could have won that war 2 full years before it did. But ever since then, we've had what's called the Cold War. It's been a world filled with tension, and everybody's grown up under the bomb. But during this time period that we call the Cold War, it's claimed more lives on the battlefield, It's brought captive more people, and it's cost more money than any hot war in history, and that is a documented fact from the congressional record of the United States. Yet millions of Americans just cannot comprehend that we're really at war with the Soviet Union, whether we're in a hot war or not, because our ideologies are exactly the opposite. One of them is atheistic, the other is a belief in God. This is why we're so rapidly deteriorating in the United States. We haven't had a single victory, not even a moral victory, much less a hot war victory since World War II. So within this time period that's been called the Cold War, since right after World War II, there's been hot wars. You've had China, which fell to the communists, Malaya, Indonesia, which we were engaged in. You had Algeria, the Congo, Cuba, Iraq, the Gaza Strip. Israel's had several wars. Hungary, Korea, Angola, Burma, Tibet. Today we have San Salvador. We've already had the overthrow in Nicaragua, which was very silent and played down on the news media. You've had wars in Egypt. And in every single case, the Marxist socialists, whatever war they're involved in, they've ended up being the winner. And the United States was the loser every single time. There has been no exception. There's been no big war because they haven't needed a big war. They continue their brush fire wars because they win and we lose every single time. So think about that now. Ever since World War II ended in 1945, the Soviets only held 160 Russians in slavery. That was in World War II. And yet, the czars actually controlled more land mass, not necessarily population, but they had a larger land mass than the Soviets did once they overthrew the czar. Communism, after World War II, was a third-rate military, economic, and industrial country. Third rate. Couldn't even compare with the United States. And yet, 37 years later, today, the United States has spent $1.5 trillion to fight communism. We've lost over 100,000 men to stop these wars of aggression. And yet, with all these expenditures, think about this now, in dollars and lives, the communists openly control now over 50% of the land mass in the world. That's 37 years in which we have been giving lives and dollars, and we haven't won a single war. And they have won every time. And now they openly control 50% of the world land mass. Now, Fidel Castro is 90 miles off our borders. So you can begin to see there's got to be something wrong somewhere. There's got to be. Well, remember one of the 45 points that the socialist communists wanted to promote within the United States was that the United Nations is the only hope for world peace. Now I want to talk about the United Nations just a little bit. And a lot of this information was taken from the United Nations Information Council of Missouri. And it's an exhaustive amount of information concerning the United Nations. So during and after World War II, I guess you would agree that every honorable person on earth, anyone who wanted to see war cease and another Hitler not to rise, had to come to the forefront and say, hey, let's promote a world institution. Well, it was nearly, I guess you would say, it was hysteria at the San Francisco conference in 1945. Because nobody wanted to see another bloodbath, especially in this country. And they didn't want to see it expanded into Africa, South America, and over into Asia. So as the years passed, the Soviet Union, though, continued reiterating over and over their objective was world conquest. And one nation after another, which I just mentioned, had kept falling behind the Iron Curtain in spite of the United Nations organization. To be exact, there was an average of 7,000 newly enslaved people every hour of every day since World War II and since the United Nations was formed. Now, if you were a part of an organization that was to stop world aggression, and yet this amazing achievement of expansion continued full force, wouldn't you suspect something was wrong within that organization? It would begin to look like it. Well, there were several members of the Congress of the United States, many anti-communist groups, many religious organizations. To be exact, one which I went to Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, to college. And it had one of the strongest anti-communist organizations there. It was called the Freedom Foundation. George S. Benson was president of the college, and he headed up this foundation. He toured the country giving speeches just like I'm giving tonight. And so that's where I got a little of my background. But anyway, and many other concerned citizens, such as the Daughters of the American Republic, the John Birch Society, congressmen like John B. Utt, Congressman John H. Roosevelt, Senator James O. Eastland from Mississippi. These all began to come out with charges against the United Nations organization. And if you were to condense everything that they stated and put it in one simple statement, this is what it would say. The United Nations was created by communists. It is controlled by communists and can only bring about a communist world. Now, if I'm going to make such a statement and repeat what they condensed, I have got to have some facts to back it up. It only makes sense. You better not speak unless you know what you're saying, and unless you can send somebody and let them see the proof with their own eyes. So let's go into the part where it says it's created by communists. The Charter of the United Nations was drafted at the San Francisco Conference in 1945. Now, critics of the United Nations used their own founding documents as absolute proof that it was written by communists to bring about the creation of a world government of socialist communists. And I only want to read a couple of the statements within it. The United Nations Covenant on Human Rights, I want to give just a couple of sections on it. Article 15, Section 3. Freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. Now think about that a minute. And then I want to read another one while you're thinking about that. Article 20. The rights of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. So you and I, they'll recognize that we can come here peacefully. No restriction may be placed on the exercise of this right other than, notice every time there's always that other than, those imposed in conformity with the law. Everyone who has ever studied the Charter and the Constitution of the Soviet Union knows that every article of their Constitution is phrased exactly like this. They guarantee private religion just like you and I, but they state as the only way you can't have your private religion is if it's imposed by law. Every single time they pass a law and restrict any free movement of citizens. And this is exactly what the United Nations organization is going to do once it becomes a world government. Everything is offered as free unless it's imposed by law. And then they're going to pass the laws, and you and I aren't going to have religion, not Christian religion anyway. We're going to either worship Satan and his false Messiah, or else he's going to kill us if they can find us. So this is just to give you a little idea that there is something that smells in the United Nations. And when you begin to look at the founding documents, you can see that it's nothing more than a blueprint for tyranny, just like the Constitution of the Soviet Union. But now, let's go to our home team. Right here, the United States of America, it has got to be the most anti-communist country in the world. I think everybody would agree with that. Nobody here would want to live under a communist government and lose our freedom. Okay, I want to give you the names of every person that represented the United States from the State and the Treasury Department who helped to write the Charter for the United Nations. Here they are. Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Virginius Frank Coy, Dean Acheson, Noel Field, Lawrence Dugan, Henry Julian Wadley, John Carter Vincent, David Weintraub, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, Harry Glaser, Victor Perlow, Irvin Kaplan, Abraham George Silverman. Sounds like a Jewish convention. Never mind. Solomon Adler, William L. Ullman, and William H. Taylor. This is documented in the Congressional Record from the Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation 1939 to 1945. Stated within the following document, the interlocking subversion in Government Department Senate Internal Security Subcommittee report, July 30th, 1953, it states that every one of those men named, with the sole exception of Dean Acheson, were known communists. Now, they're the ones who helped write the charter in which they're trying to merge us into as a world government to prevent nuclear annihilation of all people. The communist control of the United Nations organization is something else that many people have talked about and discussed. But you have to understand where the power within this organization comes from. Number one, it is not from the General Council. This is nothing more than a sounding board of communist propaganda. They stand up and make a proposal, somebody else argues back and forth, and then they take a vote on it. Then they send it to the Security Council, which is usually the big five: Britain, Soviet Union, the United States, France, a few of those. And then Soviet Union will either veto it if it's in our favor. Then if it's in the Soviet Union's favor, we'll veto it, so nothing's ever done, see? The real power in the United Nations organization is in the Secretariat. Now, the Secretariat is nothing more than permanent employees who are hired and paid wages by each nation that they come from. They're right in the United Nations World Organization. They're there all the time. They live in New York City or in Switzerland, whichever part of the organization that they're working for. These are the people who have the power to control the entire organization. They're the one that makes the laws, and then they submit them to different countries for ratification and acceptance into the world organization. Now, with this in mind, remember, we have never won a war since World War II. Just keep that in mind, because we're going to get to something in just a minute. And remember who has the power in the organization. It's the Secretariat. But in 1952, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee began an investigation of United States citizens who were employed by the United Nations organization. Now, this gets very interesting. Of the 33 citizens that were employed in the United Nations, called as witnesses before this subcommittee, and I think I was 12 years old, and I was watching this on TV, and every time one of these United Nations organization employees was asked a question, they would say, the Fifth Amendment. I can't answer that because it might incriminate me. Now, remember that, because out of all of these witnesses, 26 refused to answer questions concerning whether they had Communist Party affiliations or not. 26 out of the 33. They took the Fifth Amendment every time. 12 employees refused to say whether or not they would even swear allegiance and support the United States in the event of a war with Russia. That's the home team. That's our guys. We're the most anti-communist country in the world. I smell a rat. Somewhere in the woodshed I smell something. I sure do. But anyway, all of this led Senator James O. Eastland of Mississippi, who happened to be the subcommittee chairman. He made the following statement as a direct result of his questioning of these people. I am appalled at the extensive evidence indicating that there is today in the United Nations among the American employees the greatest concentration of communists that this committee has ever encountered. That's our home team. Now, how are you going to win when your home team is for the other guy? It's pretty tough. He states, and I'll go ahead with a quote, I believe that the evidence shows that the security officers of our government, now this is the security officers who sent these employees to the United Nations, knew, or at least had reason to know in advance, that these people have been communists for many years. End of quote. Our own government officials who sent them there knew they were the enemies. And yet, there they are. And they're still there today. Well, this is very startling. But now remember I mentioned, why is it that we haven't won a war since World War II? We've been engaged in at least 2 peacekeeping military actions under the auspices of the United Nations organization. One of them was Korea, remember? And we had one arm tied behind us. We couldn't go across the 38th parallel. They could come down and shoot our guys, and they'd run back across the 38th parallel. We couldn't go after them. Well, then you had Vietnam. You had the demilitarized zone. We couldn't go past it. Same thing. Same ploy. Let them come down, shoot us up, then they run behind the line where they have sanctuary. Well, there was reasons for this. Remember that our own employees in the United Nations, they were all for the other team. Now, the Secretariat is the governing force within the United Nations. Within the United Nations, there is a position that heads up the military. During the San Francisco Conference, the United States of America and the Great Britain guaranteed that a Soviet communist would always head up the military apparatus of the United Nations. That was an absolute guarantee when the foundation of that organization came about. And I'm going to give a quote proving it. One of the Secretary Generals of the United Nations was Trygve Lie, L-I-E. He wrote a book called In the Cause of Peace. And I will give you a little background first so that when I come into the quote, you'll know what he's talking about. There was going to be a changeover. They were going to get rid of one man who was heading up the armed forces, the peacekeeping apparatus for the United Nations. So the new Secretary General was going to select, or that was this man, Lie himself. He was going to select American to head up the military. Well, the minute he mentioned this, the representative of the USSR, who was a Mr. Wyszynski, he did not delay his approach, and I'm quoting from his book. He was the first to inform me of an understanding which the Big Five had reached in London on the appointment of a Soviet national as Assistant Secretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs. Always a Soviet national. Now notice, Mr. Stetness, this is the United States Secretary of State at that time, confirmed to me that he had agreed with the Soviet Union in the matter. Our own Secretary of State slit our throat. Our own men. Now let's go on with a quote. The preservation of international peace and security was the organization's highest responsibility, and the Americans had agreed to entrust the direction of the Secretariat Department most concerned with peace to the Soviet national. That's why the Soviets continue to win everywhere in the world, and the United Nations never stop them. But if the United States starts to give military aid outside of the jurisdiction of the United Nations to San Salvador, then the United Nations speaks up and objects, and then we back down every time because they are in charge. So see, what happened was, in Korea and in Vietnam, here was the head of the peacekeeping forces, and he was a communist. So he tells the other communists all of our tactics, all of our maneuvers. So they just move over, and we get up here and there's open fields. And then they go over here and attack in another city. Then when we run back over there, they move to another place because they're getting the tip-off of where we're going to be in advance. Now this is the good guys. Our home team. They're the communists too, see? Well, if that's not enough to blow your mind, I want to give you just a little more information about some of the people who have been representatives of our government to the United Nations organization. Mr. Arthur Goldberg, he was the United States ambassador in the United Nations. He also served on the Supreme Court of the United States. And many adverse decisions were made that has been hurting this country through him. But Mr. Goldberg was the past president of the Chicago chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. Now, the National Lawyers Guild has been cited, and I quote, as the foremost legal bulwark of the Communist Party. Does that speak for itself? Sure does. I've got all this documented. We'll eventually have it in Newswatch magazine. He also served as sponsor of the Conference of Constitutional Liberties in America. This was designated as a Communist Front organization by the Attorney General of the United States. Dynamite. Our own man who served later on the Supreme Court. He also, as Secretary of Labor for the United States government, Goldberg appointed Walter Gellhorn as arbitrator for a maritime labor organization. Now, why do I mention that? Because Mr. Gellhorn was identified in 1953 as a member of the Communist Party by the Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations, and he was entangled with those also. So this is just one man who has been a direct ambassador to the United Nations from our government. Well, what about Mr. Ralph Bunche? He was the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. He was the organizer for the National Negro Congress. This was cited as a subversive and communist organization by the Attorney General of the United States. He also was a contributing editor of Science and Society magazine. This was cited as a communist publication. He also sponsored Mr. Jack S. Harris, an already identified communist, to a key post in the United Nations. And yet the Senate upheld his confirmation. Now, what about Mr. Philip Jessup? He happened to have been the judge in the United Nations World Court, representing the United States. He was a member of the Institute of Pacific Relations, which was founded way back in the 30s to reorient American policy toward international socialist goals. This was cited, and I quote, as the Institute of Pacific Relations was a vehicle used by the communists to orient American Far Eastern policy toward communist objectives. This was found in the Senate Report number 2050, 82nd Congress, second session, page 225. Every person that goes to the United Nations organizations from our anti-communist nation ends up being a communist. How do they get there? It looks like we would luck up once in a while and send just one that wasn't. Somebody's sending them there who knows who they are. That's the key. Also, Mr. Philip Jessup was listed as a sponsor for the following communist-cited organizations: the National Emergency Conference, the American Law Students Association, the National Emergency Conference for Democratic Rights, the American-Russian Institute for Cultural Relations with the Soviet Union. All those were Communist Front organizations. He founded every one of them. It's got to tell you something. I believe the home team is in bad shape right now as a direct result of other people manipulating the world organization called the United Nations. Now, if this was all there was to it, I'd sit down now and shut up. But there's not. And I've got to tell you the most important thing yet, because they've come a long way, baby, as the expression goes. On May 2nd of 1974, the United Nations organization formed the new International Economic Order. The preamble to that declaration states, and I quote, "We, the members of the United Nations, solemnly proclaim our united determination to work urgently for the establishment of a new international economic order based on equity, sovereign equality, and get this word, interdependence." And the reason it's interdependence, they want to make every nation on earth dependent upon each other. So if one of them steps out of line, simply cutting off oil to us, if we step out of line, then that'll automatically cause our economy to collapse and we'll come back into line. They want every nation dependent upon each other so that none can rebel against it. The word interdependence is one of the words used in the New Age movement. This is Satanism and demonism. That's exactly what it is, and the occult is behind it. Such names as David Spangler, who is the high priest of the occult movement today. Just like the Vatican is the head of the Catholic Church, so Fenhorn, Scotland, is the head right now of the promotion of this end-time socialistic system. And they're actually training ministers of every church organization on earth. They go there, they train them, and they send them back to their congregations to prepare them to accept the New World Order and a human Messiah. But after this declaration of interdependence was declared, the United States magazine Senior Scholastic, in order to prepare the public, especially the young people, to accept this, came out with the following statements. There is a new international economic system coming. They said, number one, all consumer goods must have a computer mark. It's called the Universal Product Code, and it's on the yellow sheets that we have back there. Number two, all selling and buying must be done by computer. Number three, special drawing rights must become the standard medium, doing away with checks and currency. Number four, every individual must receive a personal number, which will be his account number in the national and international computer system. Number five, the number must be tattooed on each individual so it will not be forgotten or lost, and is a means of eliminating fraud. And it went on to state very clearly in that article there will be no currency, no checks, no change. It'll be a totally cashless, coinless, checkless society with nothing but instant transfer of funds. And to start out with, right now in Cincinnati, Ohio, as an experiment, in September they're going to have a bank card. All they do is insert it into a terminal, and it transfers money for all your groceries. Kroger is in on this. And Kroger Food Company, it'll just transfer your money from your account right into the Kroger bank account instantly. No checks, no currency, no change. Alpha Beta in California has been doing it for a good while. And there is also the largest chain of grocery stores in Des Moines, Iowa that has complete transfer of funds. But what this all amounts to is they stated in here that eventually you must have your own number printed on your hand or on your forehead. And now the newest innovation on the Universal Product Code, which has not been introduced yet, it's only in the preparation stage, states very clearly that there will be an H on one end of some of the code marks and an F on the other. And the projection is, based upon Bible prophecy, the F is going to stand for forehead and the H hand, showing the location where your number is going to be. So we'll just have to wait and see. But now I want to give you a quote from a representative of the United States to the United Nations organization, Dr. Saul H. Mendelvich. He declared, and I quote, "There is no longer a question of whether or not there would be a world government. For the declaration of interdependence is a part of the continuing drive to dilute, then dissolve the sovereignty of the United States of America for the new world order, a new international economic order." You can't get clearer than that. Somebody's in the woodshed, folks, and they're stealing our wood, and they're taking everything we have. Well, that basically is all I want to talk about tonight as far as this part is concerned. But tomorrow night, I'm going to be going into absolute specifics as to what organizations. I can't go through all 10,000. I'm only going to go through basically 3 or 4 organizations. I'm going to list who is behind them. And these are the organizations that are the most influential in America today in dismantling us for this world government. But in Mark 1, verse 14 and 15, Jesus Christ came on the scene stating that we should repent. We should repent. And that we should believe the gospel. And the gospel is that there is coming a world government. And you and I, as New Testament Christians, have an opportunity to rule in that government. It'll be a government of love and offering salvation to the world. In Acts 17, verse 30, the Apostle Paul says that the time past God winked at the ignorance of men. But today they can repent. They can get right with God. They can obey Him all the way. And Jonah preached to Nineveh. And he preached obedience to God's law so that people would quit sinning. Every person from the oldest to the youngest repented in sackcloth and ashes. That nation was spared. It didn't fall. Ezekiel 14, verse 6, 8, 12 through 14, and 16 through 20 shows that even though such righteous men as Noah or Daniel or any of the other prophets that you want to mention could fit in there, even though these men lived in this country or any other country that had gone into gross idolatry and sin and to breaking every commandment of God there is, that nobody in that nation would be spared. They would be saved for their sins only. Nobody else would go into the kingdom of God or be spared from death unless they themselves obeyed God and repented of their sins. Ezekiel 33, verse 2 to 9 states very clearly that a ministry or ministries, many, I don't know how many God is going to use to warn this nation of what's going to happen, but because we've turned our back upon God, He says, you go tell the people that they have to repent. And when you see the destruction of that nation coming, and if you go and tell the people, even though they don't believe you, at least their blood is not on your head. But if you don't go tell them when you know it's going to happen, then that blood is upon my head. And that's why I'm standing here telling you, I don't want that blood on my head. You have an opportunity to repent and come to God all the way. And Psalms 91 is what I want to conclude with tonight. Psalms 91. He that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I'll say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom will I trust. Surely He shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler. Verse 4, He shall cover you with His feathers, and under His wings shall you trust. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. Verse 5, you shall not be afraid for the terror by night. And if you studied the history of every country on earth that the socialist communists have overthrown, you'd better be afraid. But if you're in Jesus Christ and you've repented of your sins and you want to go in that watery grave of baptism and have all sins forgiven and come up and receive God's Holy Spirit, then you're under the protection of Jesus Christ as long as you go all the way and obey Him. Verse 6, you shouldn't be afraid for the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor for the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right side, but it shall not come nigh to you. That's to somebody who has totally surrendered to Jesus Christ. Totally obedient. Not to someone who's indifferent, who thinks he can get by with a deathbed confession and thinks that's going to do it. Verse 8, only with your eyes shall you behold and see the reward of the wicked, and the wicked are going to fall all around us. I hope you'll come back tomorrow night. I want to get real specific. Thanks for coming.